I was standing at the edge of a dock on Sharbot Lake, holding a mug of tea I hadn't taken a single sip from, when the woman who sat across the open plan office from me turned to her father and said, "Dad, this is Eli, my boyfriend." I felt the dock shift slightly beneath my feet. Or maybe that was just me. 20 pairs of eyes swung toward us across the water's evening light, and I had exactly 3 seconds to decide: correct her right there in front of her entire family, or play along. I played along, and it was the strangest, most clarifying decision I have ever made in my life. My name is Eli Thorne. I am 38 years old. I work as a senior project coordinator at Carruthers Civil Consulting, a mid-sized engineering firm in Kingston, Ontario, the kind of place where the coffee machine breaks every second Thursday, and nobody fixes it until someone's frustration finally overrides their politeness, which takes longer than it should because Canadians. I spend my days tracking permits, managing site timelines, coordinating between engineers and municipal planners, making sure things get built on time and on budget and in the right place. I am good at keeping things from falling apart. My own life at the time this story begins was a different project entirely. Gwen and I had been common law for 6 years. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment near the Rideau Canal, had a shared RRSP beneficiary I kept forgetting to update, and a Tuesday routine that involved Thai takeout and whatever was on CBC. When she ended things, she was kind about it in the way that hurts more than cruelty, measured, careful, clearly thought through over a long stretch of time, before it was ever said aloud. She told me that being with me was like sharing a home with someone who was always somewhere else in his mind, that she had never once felt like she had my full attention. She was not wrong. I did not argue with her. I helped her pack on a Saturday in October, carried boxes to her car, waved from the curb as she drove away, and then went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a very long time, looking at the small herb garden I'd started growing on the balcony: mint, thyme, a rosemary that was struggling, and could not explain, even to myself, why I had planted it or what I expected to come from it. For 2 years after that, I was alone in a way I told myself was fine, and which was not, by any honest measure, fine. Lena Beaumont transferred from the Montreal office in late February, 8 months before the cottage weekend. She was a landscape architect, sharp and precise in the way people who are genuinely excellent at something tend to be, quiet until the moment they aren't, and then impossible to ignore. She sat across the office from me, separated by 2 rows of desks, and a plant nobody remembered to water, and she existed at the edge of every meeting right up until the moment she spoke, at which point whatever had been said before her suddenly felt approximate. She ate lunch alone, every day at noon, out in the small courtyard behind the building, sitting on the concrete bench even in Nayatland February, with her coat pulled tight, reading whatever book she had in her bag. She did not invite company. She did not appear to need it. I noticed her the first week. Most people noticed Lena, though she would have been surprised to hear it. The first Thursday after she arrived, I found half an orange on the left corner of my desk when I came in. It had been peeled, neatly, cleanly, every strand of pith removed, and wrapped in a small cloth napkin. No note, no name. I looked around the office and saw nothing explanatory. I ate the orange. It was good. The following Thursday, another half orange, same corner, same napkin. The Thursday after that, the same. I counted. By the time Lena approached my desk on a Friday afternoon in late June and asked if I'd be willing to drive up to her family's cottage for the Canada Day-long weekend, there had been 19 oranges, each one placed before I arrived in the morning, each one with no explanation attached. 19 times I had picked it up and said nothing, partly because I didn't know what to say, and partly because I was afraid that if I said something she'd stop. She stood at the edge of my desk with the same neutral tone she used to deliver a permit update, and explained that her father had been recovering from bypass surgery since April and couldn't do any heavy lifting. Her brother Kurt was pulling a double shift at the fire station that weekend. They needed someone to help bring the kayaks up from the water, re-secure a dock section that had come loose over winter, carry things back and forth. "You're good at that kind of thing," she said, which I took as a reference to the fact that I'd helped move the photocopier 2 floors down during the office renovation in May. I said yes without thinking about it. She nodded and walked back to her desk. I drove north on the Friday afternoon of the long weekend. The highway gave way to 2-lane county roads, then gravel, then pine trees so dense on both sides that the light came through in flat, pale strips. The GPS took me down a lane that opened up to a white frame cottage, set back from a lake, so still it looked like a piece of sky that had dropped to the ground and forgotten to leave. Glenn Beaumont met me at the dock, a broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, slower than he probably used to be, with hands that showed decades of work and a handshake that told you exactly what kind of man he was without requiring any words at all. He looked me straight in the eye the way fathers do when they're measuring you against a standard they've never written down but always know by feel. I held his grip and didn't look away. Ruth appeared from behind him and pressed a cold can of ginger ale into my hand before I'd said 10 words. "Lena's told us so much about you," she said, warm and easy like she'd been expecting me for years. I nearly choked on nothing at all. Lena had been at the firm for 4 months. In 4 months she had spoken perhaps 40 words to me beyond good morning and project notes. The idea that she had told her family anything about me, let alone much, was so far outside what I'd understood as possible that I simply nodded and smiled and carried the first kayak up from the water. The family treated me like I had always been standing on that dock. Glenn walked me through the process of resecuring the floating dock section, handing me bolts without me asking, explaining as he went. At one point he sat back on his heels while I drove home a fitting with the socket wrench and said, with no particular preamble, "The lake doesn't rush in summer. You watch people come up from the city and spend the first 2 days fighting that. They want the weekend to start faster. But the lake just does what it does." He tapped the dock planking with one knuckle. "Anything worth having holds the same way. You don't force it, you just make sure the foundation's solid." I assumed he was talking about cottage maintenance. I spent the afternoon lifting, fixing, laughing at Glenn's stories, the summer Lena was 14, and tried to paddle a canoe to the far shore alone, and underestimated both the distance and the wind. Ruth described the winter. She and Glenn got stuck on the 401 in a whiteout for 4 hours and ate gas station sandwiches in the car, and still counted it as one of their best trips. Cousins and aunts arrived as the afternoon stretched. People I had never met shook my hand and called me by my first name. For the first time in longer than I could accurately track, I felt included in something, without having had to earn the right to be there. The fire pit was lit as the sky went amber above the pines. The loons started calling across the water, that low trembling note that belongs entirely to this country, that sound that tells you precisely where you are on the planet. Someone passed around marshmallows. Glenn took a long stick and showed me the correct technique. Slow rotation. You want even, all the way around. The second you hold it still it burns, same as most things that actually matter. Consistency, not intensity. He grinned. "That's my grandmother's philosophy. Only family gets to hear it." I assumed he was being generous to a guest. I did not yet understand what Glenn already believed I was. Then Lena crossed the grass toward me. She moved through the family the way she moved through the office, self-contained, pausing to touch a cousin's shoulder, saying something brief to an aunt. When she reached me, her arm slid through mine the way something does when it has been imagined many times and finally happens before the conscious mind can get in the way. She turned to her father and said, in a voice warmer than any I had ever heard from her, "Dad, this is Eli, my boyfriend." The mug in my other hand tilted. Tea very nearly went everywhere. Glenn's face opened into the widest, most genuine smile I had ever seen on a man his age. Ruth was on her feet and had her arms around me before I had fully processed the sentence, and over her shoulder I found Lena's eyes. She was looking directly at me. The look said everything her voice couldn't carry in front of 20 people. "Please, not here, not now, I'll explain, just trust me." I gave one small nod. And for the rest of the evening, I played the part. I sat beside Lena at the table. I answered questions about my work, my apartment in Kingston, how we'd met. When someone asked how long we'd been together, Lena answered without hesitating, "Since February," exactly when she had transferred to the Kingston office. I listened to her answer question after question, and I realized with a slow and disorienting clarity that every single detail she gave her family that evening was true. All of it. The office, the city, the timeline, the specific detail that I had once helped her carry a large print tube up 3 flights of stairs when the elevator was out. She had taken the entire accurate truth of the past 4 months and changed exactly one word. Colleague became boyfriend. Everything else was fact, tilted a few degrees toward a future that did not yet exist. Kurt arrived after dinner, still in his station jacket. He stood at the edge of the gathering with his arms crossed, scanning me with the unhurried efficiency of someone who does not waste attention. He did not extend his hand. He said flat and unreadable, "So you're the one she won't stop talking about." Two meanings at once, I felt both of them. Lena drove back to Kingston with me that night. Her car was in for service. We sat in the parking area above the dock after the family had gone inside, and the cottage lights dimmed behind us, and the lake made no sound at all. She didn't speak for 4 full minutes. I watched the dashboard clock and held still. Then she said, "My dad's surgery in April wasn't as routine as we made it sound. The cardiologist told him his heart function is lower than they want. He's not in immediate danger, but he's not where they'd like him to be. He knows this." She kept her eyes on the dark road ahead. "He hasn't said anything to us directly, but I came home in May and found him going through old photo albums and writing out account passwords and making a list of where he keeps important documents. He's getting things in order quietly, so we won't have to." A long pause. "Every time I visit, the only thing he keeps asking me is whether I'm going to be okay, whether I have someone." I let her say it. I couldn't find anyone I trusted enough to bring into this, anyone who would actually understand what I was asking. A beat. "Except you." She did not cry. She sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, like something using every ounce of its structure just to stay upright. I looked at her once quickly, and looked back at the road. In that fraction of a second, I recognized an expression I knew. The face of someone who has held something alone for so long that finally saying it out loud leaves them lighter and hollowed out at the same time. I drove her home to Princess Street. She stepped out at the curb, said goodnight without turning around, and walked to the door. I waited until the light came on inside. Then I sat there another minute with the engine idling, trying to understand what was happening in my chest, because it felt like something being rearranged without anyone asking my permission. When I got back to my apartment, I found a small mason jar wedged carefully in the back seat, handwritten label in neat block letters, "For family, Beaumont recipe." Ruth had slipped it in without anyone noticing, maple butter thick and amber behind the glass. The label was slightly crooked, written with care rather than precision. The last time anyone had called me family, I still had a shared phone plan and a gym membership with someone else's name on the account. I set it on the kitchen counter beside the salt and stood there looking at it for longer than made any practical sense. I agreed to continue. Every second Sunday I drove to Glenn and Ruth's brick semi-detached near Confederation Park, a proper Kingston house owned by the same family through 3 different mayors. I played cribbage with Glenn at the kitchen table. I helped him rehang the screen door that had been dragging on its frame since spring. Ruth taught me how to make tourtière from scratch, the Beaumont family recipe, involving specific spices and a technique for the pastry she demonstrated, with the calm patience of someone who has taught this many times, and each time makes it look effortless. Lena and I were clear with each other about what this was, an arrangement, a performance with a purpose, nothing more. Things were not in any honest sense, nothing more. Her hand would brush mine when she passed the salt across the table, and she would let it hold 1 beat longer than was accidental. She laughed differently with me than she did with anyone else. Quieter, fuller, like the sound only had room in the space that was just ours. I started counting the days from Sunday to Sunday. By Friday afternoons I was looking at the clock, calculating hours. One quiet Tuesday, a senior drafter named Gil Prentice leaned against the edge of my desk. Gil had been with Carruthers longer than the current carpet had, and he had the unhurried manner of a man who had seen enough to know which things were worth noting. He said, casual as reading the weather, "You know Lena's been leaving that orange on your desk since her very first Thursday here." I said nothing. I asked her once why she doesn't just hand it to you directly. He took a slow sip of his coffee. She said, "If I put it in his hands, he'll feel like he has to say something, and I don't want him to talk to me because he thinks he's supposed to. I want him to talk to me because he wants to." Something shifted inside my chest. Not a small thing. The kind of movement that happens in a wall you didn't know was load-bearing until it finally moves. 2 weeks after that, Gwen called. She had seen a photo Ruth posted on Facebook. Lena tagged, Lena had shared it, and there I was at the fire pit, arm resting on the back of the bench where Lena sat, the lake dark behind us. Gwen connected every dot in under a minute and called me that evening. With an edge she was working hard to conceal beneath something that sounded like idle concern. "You didn't think to mention you're seeing someone." She had a reason prepared. Our joint checking account, the last of the shared finances that had been sitting in administrative limbo for months. The account was real, the reason was not. Underneath it was something older. I had been the quiet one, the one too far inside his own head, and people who are classified that way are not supposed to quietly become a different version of themselves. I had broken an unspoken rule in her version of events. I was not supposed to find somewhere I looked like I belonged. I was certainly supposed to find it with someone who had never once needed me to be louder. She reached out to contacts she still kept at the firm. The gossip moved through Carruthers Civil in 48 hours. By Wednesday, the whole office was certain Eli Thorne was seeing Lena Beaumont. By Thursday, HR sent a firm-wide email about internal relationship disclosure guidelines. Friday morning, Lena was called into the managing director's office. She came out 22 minutes later with the color completely gone from her face. She sat at her desk and did not look in my direction once for the rest of the day. That evening she sent me one text message, 7 words, "I'm sorry I dragged you into this." I sat in my apartment staring at those words for a long time. The television was on but muted, casting pale blue light across the walls, and I understood something that had been assembling itself inside me for weeks without my awareness or consent. I was not upset about the lie. I was upset because someone had hurt her. That was the line. That was the exact place where everything shifted. I picked up my phone and called Gwen. For the first time in 2 years, I spoke more than 10 words to her in a single breath. "You left because I was too much in my own head. I found someone who doesn't need me anywhere else. Don't call me again." I ended the call. My hands were shaking. My heart was going hard enough that I could feel it in my fingertips. I was standing in the kitchen beside the mason jar on the counter, and the man Gwen had described as perpetually somewhere else had just said the most direct thing he'd said to anyone in 6 years, and he had meant every single word of it. The following Sunday I drove to Glenn and Ruth's. Not because of the arrangement, not out of obligation or guilt or any word that belongs in a contract, because I wanted to be there, simply and without negotiation. Ruth was moving more carefully than she had been. The months of managing Glenn's recovery, being the steady one, the organizer, it was showing in small ways she tried to smooth over. But she was at the stove when I came through the door, and when she looked up and saw me, something in her expression settled into quiet recognition. She reached behind the counter and pressed a second mason jar into my hands. Same glass, same handwriting, same maple butter. She tapped the lid once with one finger and said, "The first jar was to see what you'd do with it. This one is because I already know." She was not talking about maple butter. I found Kurt in the backyard 20 minutes later. He was standing near the garden fence with his arms crossed and his jaw set, the look of a man who has been holding a question for weeks and has decided the cost of keeping it is now higher than the cost of asking it. "Tell me straight," he said. "Is this real, or is this because of my dad? Because if you're here out of pity, I need to know that now, not after she gets hurt." I didn't need to search for the answer. It was already there. Every Thursday morning, I said, I check the corner of my desk before I check my email. I don't know what else to call that, but it isn't pity. Kurt looked at me for a long moment. Something in his posture shifted, not softened exactly, but resettled, the way a person stands differently when the ground beneath them confirms it will hold. Then, for the first time since we had met, he extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, and this time it was not a test. That evening, Lena and I sat on the front porch while Glenn washed up inside, humming something low and shapeless, the smell of cut grass and the particular dry warmth of a Kingston summer night. Lena looked out at the old maples lining the street for a long moment, at the sky going dark above the rooftops, and then she turned to face me. "I owe you the real version," she said. She chose her words the way she chose lines on a site plan, with full attention, allowing nothing to be imprecise. "My dad being sick, that was always true. But I didn't choose you only because I trusted you. A breath. I chose you because you were the only person I actually wanted to introduce as my boyfriend, without it feeling like a performance. It wasn't a lie. It was just ahead of schedule." She exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that sounds like it has been held for months. "Every Thursday when I left that orange on your desk, I told myself proximity was enough. Being near you was enough. But it was never enough. And when my dad got sick, and I understood that time is something that can run out on you without any announcement, I stopped waiting for the right moment. I made one." She looked at her hands. "I chose you." I sat with that for a long time. The porch light caught something in her expression that I had noticed across 19 Thursday mornings and quietly catalogued without ever letting myself name it. I counted, I said finally, 19 oranges. I never asked why because I was afraid if I asked you'd stop. She looked at me. I looked at her. A car passed slowly on the street. Somewhere in the neighborhood a screen door swung shut, and then everything was quiet. Stop calling it ahead of schedule, I said. Let me catch up. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she leaned her shoulder into mine, and we sat like that as the streetlight came on above us, and neither of us said anything else, and neither of us needed to. We started dating properly the following week, slowly, quietly, no announcements, no posts. She came to my apartment and we made tourtière together in my small kitchen. Her mother's recipe, the one Ruth had taught me, and she made it with a small private smile that made the whole kitchen feel warmer than the stove ever managed alone. I went to her place on weeknights and fixed the shelf bracket she'd been propping up with a stack of graphic standards manuals for 3 months. She brought a small rosemary plant one Saturday morning and knelt beside my balcony herb garden, pressing the roots into the soil next to the mint, brushing the dirt from her palms, and then she sat back and looked at the two plants together in the morning light and said nothing, because nothing was needed. I drove Glenn to his cardiac rehabilitation appointments at Kingston Health Sciences on the days Ruth was too worn out to make the drive. Those trips were mostly quiet. Glenn would rest his head back against the seat, and I would keep both hands steady on the wheel, and the silence between us was the kind that has no need to be filled, because filling it would only dilute it. One afternoon on the way back along Bath Road, he reached across the console and took my hand. His grip was lighter than it had once been, but it was deliberate, unhurried, certain. He said without opening his eyes, "I knew from the beginning that you weren't her boyfriend." I very nearly drove over the curb. He opened his eyes and smiled, small, knowing, not at all surprised by my reaction. "A father knows, Eli. The way you looked at her that first afternoon, standing at the end of the dock, it wasn't how a man looks at someone he already has. It was how a man looks at someone he's still hoping to reach." He squeezed my hand once, "But I also knew you would get there. Some things just need a little time and a small push." I said nothing. I kept my eyes on the road, because if I had turned to look at him in that moment, the road ahead would have blurred past any use. 8 months after that Canada Day weekend, Glenn completed his cardiac rehabilitation program. His follow-up showed real improvement in his heart function, not where it had been before, but meaningfully better than where they'd started. He moved more easily. He laughed more readily. He started talking about fishing again, about next summer at the cottage, about teaching future grandchildren to read a lake. The following Canada Day weekend, the Beaumont family went back to Sharbot Lake. Same cottage, same dock, same loons starting up at dusk across the same water, same fire pit, same red canoe tied at the shore, same smell of pine and summer. When Lena walked me to the dock at the end of the afternoon, her arm through mine, easy and certain, and Glenn looked up from his chair where he was sitting in the last of the sun, she didn't say boyfriend. She simply said, "Dad, it's Eli." Glenn grinned so wide his eyes nearly disappeared into the creases at the corners. Ruth pressed both hands over her mouth and cried the kind of tears that come from watching something you prayed for actually arrive. Kurt stepped forward and put his hand on my shoulder, solid, decided, the grip of a man who has made up his mind and means it, and said nothing because nothing was required. I was holding a can of ginger ale in both hands, steady, certain of exactly where I was standing and why. Ruth came over last. She set a small mason jar in my hands. Third one, same glass, same careful block letters on the label, but the words were different this time. Beaumont Thorne family recipe. My name was on the jar, not as a guest, not as a trial run, as part of the recipe itself. I used to think being too much inside my own head was simply who I was, a fixed characteristic, something to apologize for and work around. Gwen told me it was why she couldn't stay, and for 2 years I had no strong evidence against that. I was quiet. I was internal. I was, in her words, present in body and elsewhere in everything that counted. But Lena found me in there. She didn't need me to come out louder or perform a version of presence I had never been built to sustain. She peeled half an orange on 19 consecutive Thursday mornings, left it on the corner of my desk and waited. She introduced me as her boyfriend before I had become one. She wasn't early. I was just late, and she was patient enough to wait at the dock until I pulled in.